Hi everyone, welcome to the TriEssence martial art channel. Firstly, I hope all my viewers are still healthy and safe and away from virus, and that you take your social distancing, and hopefully by now you've got your vaccination, which isn't 100% security, but at least there's a very big chance of you not contracting the virus if you come upon contact with someone who carries the virus. Unfortunately, in South Africa, the government is only able to procure enough vaccination for the medical staff. So obviously they're going to get inoculated first, which is perfectly fine because they are the ones who have the highest risk of contacting people with carrying this virus, right, in a day-to-day life situation. However, the sad thing that I'm experiencing in South Africa is that there are certain private insurance companies that has procured vaccination through their own channel, and they are selling it in South Africa for about 3,000 South African rand. And for those of you that don't know, this translates to about $250 more or less. And as far as I know, these vaccinations cost around $30 or $50 in the country of manufacturing. And even if you calculate the cost for transportation, management, administration, all of that, it should not become $250, which is 3,000 rand, which is a price that average household in South Africa cannot afford. So this only allows the rich people to be able to afford this vaccination that's not coming from the government. And we have no idea when the government is going to procure enough vaccination for everyone. So far, they barely have enough for the medical staffs and public, government employees. And obviously it's quite stupid because these privatized companies are trying to make a killing from a pandemic without knowing that if you don't reach about 95% vaccination in your population, you cannot reach herd immunity. And if you can't reach herd immunity, you can't actually control the virus. So those are the people who actually pay the high price for this vaccination, they're not actually safe because the virus is still spreading pretty strong. It's actually in everyone's best interest to reach herd immunity as fast as possible, which is why a lot of these other foreign countries like America and China, as far as I heard, they're trying to, for the country in Africa that can't afford to buy vaccination, they are planning to get it free of charge because it is in everyone's best interest to completely quash this pandemic. And only to do so is that 95% of the entire world population is inoculated. Well, that is the goal globally. Over here, you have these selfish privatized companies that are trying to make 10 times, 20 times the profit out of the people. And that's really sad. So unfortunately over here, the pandemic is still pretty serious and it's not under control. And just because people stop caring about it because it's been so long, it's actually spreading. The spread of the virus has gone up again, which is really frustrating. So wherever you are, I hope that your country is doing a far better job than South Africa. Sadly, our government is incompetent, and the privatized insurance companies, etc., they're too selfish to care for the benefit of the whole world. Right, with that said, we're gonna start today's episode on Fact or Fiction, which is a series that I haven't done in quite a while. And the reason for today's episode is because a while back I made a video on the combat efficiency or the lack of efficiency of this Chinese martial art side stance. And on that video I had a lot of comments, a lot of which is arguing against me on the efficiency of side stance. And in one of these particular arguments, someone basically said that Chinese martial art originally was a grappling art. The striking and stuff came at a later point. And obviously this is completely wrong. And anyone who actually spent sufficient amount of time in the Chinese martial art community should already immediately be able to tell that this is utterly nonsense. However, just on the off chance that there are some of the viewers on my channel that don't know the actual development of Chinese martial art, I decided to make a video just to clarify this part. So obviously anyone who know a bit about Chinese martial art should already know that martial art, Chinese martial art, is not just striking, it's not just grappling. There are basically four things that we like to say, which is 踢打摔拿, right, which translated into kicking, striking or hitting, which refer to hands, throwing, which is 摔, and 拿, which is joint locking or seizing, right, lock and seize. So these are the four building blocks that makes up Chinese traditional martial arts. So naturally, Chinese martial art is not about grappling, and it's not about striking, it's about both. In fact, 4 things in total. However, what some of you might not know is that this 踢打摔拿 is a pretty modern summarization of Chinese martial art, meaning that this is what when the official sport institute tried to define Chinese martial art, they eventually look at everything and they came up with this conclusion that Chinese martial art consists of 踢打摔拿. So that's not always been the definition for Chinese martial art from back in the days. And obviously, even though that we can say that Chinese martial art overall have these 4 different building blocks, right? Kicking, hand striking, throwing, and joint locking. But if you actually look deeper into its history and into specific Chinese martial art, you can clearly see that there is a preference. Some of these building blocks are preferred more than others, and this is what we're going to look at in this video. So to look at that, we first need to understand Chinese martial art from the name that we gave to this particular activity, shall I say. Obviously, in modern days, when we talk about Chinese traditional martial arts, the most common term in Chinese that we use is called 武术, right? 武 means martial, 术 means technique, but in some English they decided to translate into art, which is not wrong, but 术 is more technique than art. But obviously it sounds better to say martial art, which is pretty much similar to the art of war, art of key making, art of everything, right? The Western people is very into this whole Eastern Oriental art of something, so that's why it's translated into martial arts. But 武术, strictly speaking in Chinese, means martial techniques or martial methods. And this is not to be confused with contemporary 武术. Right? One of the common confusion in this modern Chinese martial art world is that when you say 武术, they naturally think about contemporary 武术, which is the government established gymnastic version of Chinese martial arts. But the actual name for that is contemporary 武术 or national standardized 武术. So they are not just called 武术, right? 武术originally just means martial art or martial technique. It doesn't refer specifically to the contemporary version of it. But in today's society, when you say 武术, a lot of people automatically think that just only refer to contemporary martial art. That is not true. Now, with this said, the term 武术is not a new term. It has been found in Chinese manuscripts and books pretty far back, at least in Ming Dynasty, if not earlier. However, back then, 武术 is used to describe military stuff. It's not used to describe a civilian martial art. Using 武术 to describe Chinese traditional civilian-based martial arts is something that only really became predominant after People's Republic of China took over and decided to restructure the whole branding or the whole appearance of Chinese martial arts. Before the People's Republic of China, we have the Republic of China, right? The Kuomintang era. During that time, Chinese martial art is actually called 国术, right? Which literally means the technique of our nation, or the art of our nation, or national art, or national technique. 国 means national, and 术 either means technique, or you can make into art if you really want to. So during that time, they called Chinese martial art 国术 because at the time they are suffering from a national identity crisis or racial crisis, right? Because they were being bullied by the 8 armies, they were then bullied by the Japanese, and the Japanese were calling them the sick man of Asia. So overall, the whole country's morale is very low, and that's why the government decided they need to boost the national morale by promoting Chinese martial arts practice into the practice of a nation, so that more people would start to become stronger and healthy and are able to fight back against the foreign invaders. Even though you can't really use Chinese martial art to fight in a modernized military war, but at least when you are training something that is competitive and combat oriented, it gives you a stronger personality, that you have a more stronger will to participate in war instead of just running away, and you're willing to take out a gun and shoot your enemy. So that's one of the main reasons why Chinese traditional martial art was called 国术 during that period of political and social instability and upheaval. And obviously the reason that Goshu was changed into Wushu is because the People's Republic of China, when they took over China, they don't want to, to make it sound just like the Taiwanese government, which, at the time was still, or even to today, they still exist in Taiwan, right? And the People's Republic of China want to show dominance, that they are the real rulers of China, therefore they got to cut away from the old ties. That's why Goshu got changed into Wushu, and obviously Wushu is a better description than Goshu, right? Goshu, the practice or the technique of a nation or national practice, it can mean anything, right? It can mean Chinese opera. That's also something that, as a nation, China is very proud of. But Wushu obviously is a much more descriptive name given to Chinese martial art. However, if we look further back to the Qing dynasty and then even further to the Ming dynasty, we'll see that back then Chinese martial art is not called Goshu or Wushu, right? While the term Goshu was coined during the Republic era, and Wushu, the term, has been found in the old days, but not referring to civilian-based Chinese martial art. Now the question is, what do the Chinese people call their martial art during the Ming and Qing dynasty? So what this might be a common knowledge for Chinese people who, like me, who grew up in the Chinese martial community in China, but this might not be common knowledge for my Western viewers, which is why I decided to clear this up, right? So basically there are two different names that you find most commonly used to describe Chinese traditional martial art during the Ming and Qing dynasty. One is called Quan Fa. Quan means fist, Fa means the method or the law, right? In this case, it should more refer to method than the law. So it's basically the method of fist is Quan Fa. Another common term that used more in the Qing dynasty is called Quan Shu, right? Again, Shu, the same Shu from Wushu and Goshu, means either technique or art, and again, Quan means fist. So back in the day, Chinese martial art either referred to as Quan Fa, which is the method of the fist, or Quan Shu, the technique of the fist. And from this, we can already see that what is the predominant understanding or building block of Chinese traditional martial art is clearly fist. And this by itself already can dispel the argument that certain person made against my video, saying that Chinese martial was originally grappling based. If it was grappling based, then the creative name for the civilian based Chinese martial art, or the empty hand version of Chinese martial art, would not have been called Quan Fa or Quan Shu, because Quan means the fist, and fist refers to striking. And Chinese people would not name a practice that is predominantly grappling with the name of either Quan Fa or Quan Shu. And obviously, we can clearly see this when it comes to Chinese wrestling, which is called Shuai Jiao, right? There's no Quan in this name at all. So Chinese language is a very descriptive one. The name you give to something is most often what it reflects what this something is about. So when they say something called Quan Fa and Quan Shu, it means that using the first had to be the most predominant approach or method or technique found in this entity. While I keep saying that this should be common knowledge to most people in China who does Chinese martial arts, just in case some people are going to argue and say that this is not the case, it's not true historically, I'm going to just give you a few examples from historical manuscript to show you that the term Quan Fa and Quan Shu is predominantly used to describe Chinese traditional martial art. Alright, so now the first piece of historical manuscript that we're going to take a look at is a chapter taken from a military manual called Ji Xiao Xin Shu, which is a very famous military manual, one of the top 10 Chinese historical military manual, written in the late Ming dynasty by the very famous military general Qi Ji Guang. And in this particular military manuscript, the last chapter is where General Qi talks about hand-to-hand martial art training, in which he goes through the fact that he doesn't believe that empty-hand martial art is useful in military battlefield, but he does think that it is essential to be taught as a basic training and a precursor preparation towards mastering weapon in a battlefield, which is why he included the chapter in his manuscript. He also then went on to describe various well-known civilian-based Chinese empty-hand martial arts system that he found at the time and gave his thoughts on these various different styles. Interesting thing to know is that later on in his life, when he revamped his manuscript, when he changed stuff and published the second edition, he took out this last chapter on empty hand training completely. So that could suggest that later on he actually felt that this chapter is not needed at all. But that's a topic for another time. So in this last chapter, which is called 全经节要, over here we can already see from the name of the chapter, 全 means first, 经 means classical text or manuscript, 节要 basically means summary on the importance of the first classic. And from this we can already see that at the time he is referring to civilian-based empty-hand martial art as first. Not throw, not grappling, but first. Obviously, that's not to say that in these particular martial art styles there are no throwing or there are no grappling or there are no kicking, but it does show you that predominantly it focuses on using the hand as a striking tool, which is why overall it's called first and not 摔跤, which is Chinese wrestling, or anything else for that matter. So now if you look at the actual text, on the second paragraph, it reads 拳法似无欲于大战之际，然活动手足，贯勤肢体. So that first phrase you see is 拳法似无欲于大战之际, and that basically means the method of the first is not very useful in a large-scale military warfare. And notice that he uses the term 拳法, the method of the first, when he refers to empty-hand martial art. In the next chapter, he then says 学拳要身法活变，手法便利，脚法轻固. And what that says is 学拳 means to learn the first. One has to have an agile body, fast handwork, light but steady footwork, right? I mean, we don't need to talk about the actual requirements or the content, but you can see that he refers to learning hand-to-hand or empty-hand training as 学拳, learning the first, not learning the kick, learning the throw, learning the grapple, right? Again, not saying that they don't include this technique, but it's predominantly focused on hand and first striking technique. That's why it's called 拳法, the method of the first. And again, in the next chapter, it reads 俗云拳打不知，是迅雷不及掩耳. What this is basically saying is that there's an old saying. You strike somebody with a first before he knows it, because it's as sudden as a thunderclap happening in the sky. And you can't have the time to cover your ear. It just happens. Again, he's talking about what makes it a good empty hand style, which is not something that we're going to get into in this video. From this, you can see that when he talks about this chapter about hand-to-hand combat, he refers to 拳打, meaning to strike with your fist, which again shows that predominantly these techniques are focused on striking with your hand, particularly your fist, and not on any other aspect of Chinese martial art. Later on in another paragraph, he then says 大戟拳棍刀枪插把剑戟弓狮钩镰挨排之类，莫不先由拳法活动身体，其拳也为武艺之源. So in the beginning, he just listed a various different type of weapon that they use in the military, and after that, he then says 莫不先由拳法活动身手，拳法 method of the first， 其拳也乃武艺之源. The first is the foundation of all martial skill. Again, I'm not arguing whether his whether his understanding is correct or not. Like I said in my previous video, there are ample examples in other nations like Japan and medieval European where you don't need to learn hand-to-hand combat before you mastering a weapon. So I'm not saying that his viewpoint is correct, but this is again just to show you that he refers to that as first, in particularly, not anything else but first. So from here, we can basically see that every time he refers to civilian-based empty-hand martial art, or even military-based, the one that he is including in this manuscript, the 32 posture, he referred to them as 拳法, the method of the fist. Or in other sentences, he refers to them just as fist. And when he talks about it in the adjective, is 拳打, meaning striking was the fist. And from this, if you know Chinese language, you will basically understand without any reasonable doubt that he's referring to striking more than anything else, which is evident to show that originally Chinese martial art is definitely striking based. Again, not saying that there are no grapple, throw, or any other aspect, but it's definitely striking based predominantly. That is the original versions of Chinese martial arts. The person that made an argument against me in the science dance video, he tried to actually use the same manuscript to prove that his theory is true. Because in this manuscript, General Qi Jiguang also listed a collection of civilian-based Chinese martial art empty-hand styles that he have seen or have looked at the time and passed comment on each of them. And that person, due to the fact that he actually can't speak Chinese, I don't know if he Google translated or he looked at someone else's translated version, and he thinks that a lot of those listed styles are actually grappling styles, but that is incorrect. Majority of the styles that are listed are definitely hand or fist striking styles. For example, if you look from the beginning of that list, it goes with 宋太祖有32式长拳, right? That refers to the first emperor of the Song dynasty. As the legend goes, he invented a 32 posture of long fist. Although it has no relation to the long fist that we know of today, but according to Qi Jiguang's manuscript back then, there was a 32 posture long fist from the first emperor of Song. There's also a 6-step fist, 六步拳. There's monkey fist, 猴拳. Then he listed 金之温家72形拳. That's basically the 72 fists from the Wen family. Don't really know what that is anymore, but the Wen family's manuscript has survived today and has been claimed to be the origin source of 戳脚, which is a kicking style. And some also claim that 翻子拳 also came from that, which I'm not completely sure of. But the Wen family's martial manuscript did survive to this day, as far as I know, and they're basically clearly striking based martial arts. Next, he lists the 36 合锁, 36合锁. That basically means the 36 combining lock. Now, this lock 锁, if you translate it to English, you can say, it means 准 lock. But actually in Chinese, that's not 准 locking. 锁 is something else. We don't know what it is, but 准 locking in Chinese is 擒拿. 擒 means to catch, 拿 means to hold, right? 锁 is not actually the same thing. It might sound the same when translated to English, but they are not the same in Chinese. Then it's 24气探马. Again, I'm not actually sure what this is. A lot of the stuff that listed in this manuscript has been lost or has evolved into other styles that we know of today. So unfortunately, I don't know what 24气探马 is, but 气 means to throw away or to let go. So again, that person probably used Google Translate and thinks that it means to throw something, but that's actually in Chinese called 摔. It's not 气. So 气 clearly refers to something else, but we don't actually know what it is anymore. The next one is 八闪翻. Right? 八闪翻 is basically believed to be the ancestor of 翻子拳, a predominantly striking based style. As far as I know, 翻子拳 has no throw. Or maybe it does have, but very few. If you look at the way that they train, I don't do 翻子拳, but from the people that I do know who train 翻子拳in Beijing, they don't have any throws. Then there's the 12 short 12短. I'm not quite sure what that is, but chances are it's probably close range combat, like 12短打, the short striking. But again, I'm not really sure what it is, and I don't think anyone does know these days. This is from the late Ming Dynasty, so it's been quite a long time from the martial art that we have today. Next, he talks about 吕红八下. 吕红is probably the person who either invented this or is famous for this kind of a practice, and 八下basically means 8 techniques. So again, we don't actually know what it is, but chances are it is not grappling, because he compared it to 绵张短打. So in the whole sentence he says 吕红八下虽刚未及绵张短打. So that means although Lü Hong's 8 technique are very hard as in very forceful, but it is not as good as 绵张短打. Again, 绵张 is probably the name of the style or the family, and 短打 means short striking. So it's pretty stupid to compare something that if it's a grappling martial art to a striking martial art. So the fact that he compares 吕刚八下 to 绵张 short striking, that most likely would mean that 吕刚八下, the 8 technique of 吕刚, must be striking technique as well. Then he talks about 山东李半天之腿，鹰爪王之拿，千叠张之叠，张伯敬之打。So 山东李半天 is basically a person from 山东 called 李半天, and he's famous for his kicking. Then he talks about 鹰爪王之拿, the Eagle Claw King's hold, right? That's joint locking. 千叠张之叠, basically the guy's name his surname is Zhang, and he's famous for tripping people. That's why it's called 千叠张, and 之叠 means to trip. Now, this is also a quite confusing thing because I think in a lot of English translations it translates that to throw, but in the Chinese language as well as traditional martial arts, 叠法 and 摔法 are actually not the same. 摔法 is throw, like what you do in wrestling. 叠法 means to trip. Unfortunately, to be able to clarify the difference, I'll need to have my partner to actually demonstrate what it looks like. So I can't do it here. That will probably come up in a later video. But just know that in this case, 千叠张之叠 means that he's good at tripping people, but that's different in Chinese language from throwing, which is 摔或者脚, right? 摔跤, that's Chinese wrestling. So 千就叠 is not the same. And the next one is 张伯敬之打. That means 张伯敬 is also a person's name, and he's striking. So over here you can basically see that he outlines 4 different approach: kicking, joint locking, 叠 which is tripping, and then striking. But the fact that he clarified these techniques here would also confirm that the ones that he listed previously are probably all striking styles. None of those are actually grappling. So the only style that uses joint locking in this whole list is 鹰爪王之拿, which is the Eagle Claw King's grappling or holding. 拿 means to hold. And obviously 千叠张之叠, which is similar to throw, but if you actually look at the way that other Chinese martial art systems that survive to this day, what they call 叠法, you can see that it's actually not grappling because they don't actually grab hold of the person most of the time. They use other ways to trip somebody while they are doing striking techniques. Then he goes on and talks about the staff method of the Shaolin Temple and the Yang family's spear. This is not the Taiji Yang family, right? This is something completely different. At that time, the Taiji Yang family has not existed yet in terms of the Chinese martial art world. And lastly, he talks about 八子拳, which people now they believe to be the forefather of 八极拳, but there's not enough evidence here. So that pretty much covers the whole list. And out of the whole list, you can clearly see that majority of the style that he mentioned at the time are striking-based martial art. In fact, many of them, the name ends with the character 拳, like 32式长拳, right? The 32 posture long fist, 六步拳, the 6-step fist, 猴拳, the monkey fist. And if we look at in today's Chinese martial arts society, you can also see the same thing. Majority of the styles, they name end with the character fist. And any style that ends in such would basically tell you that this style predominantly focuses on striking with the hand. For example, Mantis style in Chinese is called 螳螂拳, Taiji is called 太极拳, Xingyi is called 形意拳, Fanzi is called 番子拳, and the list goes on, right? So basically, like Yong Chun Quan, Hong Quan, 客家拳, any of these styles that you can randomly look in the Chinese martial arts systems, the name all end with the character Quan, and if you look at what they do, then you can clearly see that what they may have kicks and throws and joint locks, but majority of techniques are striking with their fist. Another interesting thing here to notice is that with Pigwa, there are actually two different styles now. There are Pigwa Quan and there's Pigwa Zhang. Right? Pigwa Quan basically don't exist in the north anymore, but you can still find it in the south. It merged with another style called Monkey and become Takshong Pigwa. Right? That means the Monkey King and Pigwa. So that's a hybrid style that now exists in Hong Kong as well as overseas. And in that lineage, which I had the privilege of meeting one of the previous generation master, Shifu Zhou Qiang, and I learned some of the stuff with what he was visiting South Africa. And they specifically say that their Pigwa is called Pigwa Quan. And if you look at the form, you can also see that they actually do most of the technique with a fist. I've also have done the northern Pigwa that's still there today called Pigwa Zhang, right? Means Pigwa open hand. And if you look at their form, majority of the motion and techniques completed with the open hand. So they still have Pi and Gua, but it's done with a hand, whereas the Hong Kong version is done with a fist. From this you can see that the Chinese habit of naming a style is actually quite literal, right? If a style focuses on fist, it's called something Quan. If a style focuses on empty hand, open hand is called something Zhang. We can also see that with Bagua Zhang, right? You can see there's Taiji Quan, Taiji first, Xingyi Quan, Xingyi first, but Bagua Zhang is called Bagua Palm. Again, that's because if you look at the whole system of Bagua, majority of the time they're using the open hand. It's very few first techniques, which is why overall they are predominantly using open hand. Therefore, the style is called Bagua Zhang and not Bagua Quan. Now, I am aware that there are certain historical evidence, such as Sun Wutang, where in his book he written Bagua as Bagua Quan, not Bagua Zhang. But that could be for any number of reasons. But majority of people, when you come in to talk about Bagua, they will basically refer to as Bagua Zhang because the style uses a palm. So based on the same logic, if Chinese martial originally were predominantly grappling, then none of these styles would be called something Quan because that's just incorrect naming. And from all the examples we've given, you can see that Chinese people are not in the habit of misnaming stuff like that. So if they call something Quan, that most certainly means that the style, majority of the focus is on striking with the fist. Another interesting correlation that we can find is basically through the Chinese influence to Japan. Right? In Japan, in the old days, they basically also have the name for empty hand training. They call it Kenpo. And Kenpo, if you written them in kanji with a Chinese character, is the same character as Quan Fa. Ken is basically Quan, Po is basically Fa. So they also call empty hand training the way or the method of the fist. And this further shows that originally, in the olden days, China definitely used the term Quan Fa to describe empty hand martial art, rather than Wushu or any other term that we are using today. Next, we're going to look at another piece of evidence called Wang Zhengnan Mu Zhiming, written by Huang Zongxi. Now, I talk about this particular text in my video discussing the origin of Tai Chi. So basically, people who support the fact that Zhang Sanfeng from Wudang Mountain invented Tai Chi often reference this piece of text, written again in the late Ming Dynasty by a scholar called Huang Zongxi. And he's supposedly written this for a friend that he knows which died, and this person is called Wang Zhengnan. So it's basically a summary of his life that he written to place on Wang Zhengnan's tombstone. Now, in my previous video, I basically expressed that a lot of the historical scholars today don't believe that they're actually discussing martial art. They believe it's more of a political hidden meaning to hint at fighting against the Manchurians and supporting the Han people's rule over China. But this video, we're not going to discuss exactly what this piece of text is supposed to refer to. We're just going to look at one simple description that it uses within this piece of text. In the first paragraph, he talks about how Zhang Sanfeng learns his martial arts. Again, I don't believe it to be true, but in the text he says, 夜梦玄帝授之拳法. That means in the night, he dreamed of one of the deities of the Taoist religion that teaches him Quan Fa, the method of the fist. So you can clearly see that they're referring to martial art as Quan Fa in the late Ming Dynasty. And in the later chapter, there's another sentence that says 故人为言征南善权法 means that people say that 征南, right, is the person that he's written this piece of text for, the person in the grave, Wang Zhengnan. So he's basically saying people say that Zhengnan is very good at 权法, again referring to the method of the first. I mean, of course, I could include even more examples, but let's not waste more time, right? These two should give you enough examples, and if you're interested, you can always find your own example. The term 权法 is used a lot whenever it comes to describing empty-hand training of Chinese martial art during the Ming and the Qing dynasty. Next, let's look at another term that people use, particularly from the Qing to the Republic era, called 拳术, right? Like we said early on, 术 means technique, or it could mean art if you really stretch it, and again, 拳 means first. But let's look at a piece of text written by Sun Lutang, one of the most famous internal martial art practitioners of the Republic era, in his own book, the Sun Lutang 武学录. And obviously, at the time when Sun Lutang wrote the book, it was already Republic era, and the term 国术 has already been coined, right? The art of our nation, or the national practice, 国术, has already been the standard description for Chinese martial art at the time. However, in Sun Lutang's own book, he still used the term 拳术 to describe Chinese martial art, like in this case. 经国家振兴术务百度维新，学校之中加入拳术一门. So what these sentences are saying is basically that, in this day and age, our nation decided to improve our civilians' duty and to modernize everything. And therefore, in our school, they've added 拳术一门 as a study. So that means that in our schools, they've added Chinese martial art empty-hand training. Again, I could find even more examples, but I'd rather not waste time. And to anyone who actually speaks Chinese, who lived in China and lives in the Chinese martial community, this isn't news. We all know that it used to be called 拳法 and also as 拳术. And that wushu is actually a very modern term. In fact, to this day, there are still a lot of traditional Chinese martial art practitioners in China who doesn't like the term wushu, not because the term itself is wrong, but because so many people now associate the term wushu with contemporary Chinese martial arts. And for those people, they like to call what they do 传武, means traditional martial art. And a part of us, myself included, we also call it 传统拳, means traditional fist. And this is basically a reminiscence of back in the days where we refer to Chinese martial art as 拳法 or 拳术, method of the fist or techniques of the fist. And also back in the Qing dynasty and Republic era, when you are referring to a martial art master at the time, you often refer to him as a 拳师. Shi means a teacher or a master, and 拳 means fist. So basically, the master of the fist or a teacher of the fist. You can see that the term fist, 拳, can be interchanged with other Chinese characters to mean whether a martial art master, a martial art style, martial art technique. So you can see that back in the days that the term fist is interchangeable with the term wu, which means martial, and it's actually been used more than the term wu. So while the term wu shi can also stand, wu shu can also stand, but 拳 is used more than wu in those days, which further reflect the nature of Chinese martial art, which is predominantly focusing on particular fist striking more than anything else. Next, let's use the logic of deduction and exclusion to further analyze this topic of argument and discussion. So if we take any Chinese martial art system that consists of striking and kicking, throwing, and joint locking, then that style chances are is called something quan, right? Like Tanglang Quan, Mantis Fist, or Shaobei Quan, Northern Shaolin Fist, etc., etc. However, if you take a style that only has grappling or throwing and no striking, for example, Chinese 摔跤 or Chinese wrestling, you can clearly see that this particular approach of training is not called something quan, it's just called 摔跤 or 摔跤. 摔 refers to smashing something, which in this case referring to throw, but actually in Chinese this 摔 means to smash, not to throw. Throw is actually 丢, so they're actually different term in Chinese than in English. and jiao, although in modern term is also referring to falling or throwing, but it most likely came from an old traditional term called jiao. And jiao in the old days, we can trace back even to the earlier as Han Dynasty, refer to jiao li, which is basically an ancient form of wrestling where they lock hands with each other and see who's stronger. So in this case, you can see that when a particular practice of combat that does not involve striking at all, in the name you don't see the term fist or quan. Now we can also then look at other Chinese martial styles that don't have throws at all. For example, Tongbei Quan. Tongbei Quan originally have 0 throw and have very few kicks, but it's still called Tongbei Quan, right? Tongbei fist. So you can see that when you name a style first, the only requirement it need to have is the fact that the style strike with a fist. And when the style don't have striking with a fist at all, then the name does not have the term quan in it. And then if you look at all the Chinese martial arts systems that survive today, majority of them have their name ending with the character quan or fist, and therefore it's very clear that striking, particularly with your fist, is the predominant approach of combat in all Chinese martial arts systems. Now some of you might think, okay, but in today's world, Tongbei does have throwing. But what you might not know is that, for example, Baiyuan Tongbei, they have throwing because they, at some point, introduced Chinese wrestling into the system. So it does not originally have throw. It was added at a later point. And other Tongbei lineages, such as Wuxing Tongbei, the one that I practice, it just simply have no throwing at all. It only has striking and only 1 kick. So the whole style only has 1 kick, no throw, no joint locking, and everything else is just fist and hand striking. And it's still considered as a Chinese martial art, Tongbei Quan, Tongbei fist, right? So from this you can see that even though Chinese martial art in general consists of 4 building blocks, Ti Da Shuai Na, kicking, striking, throwing, and joint locking, but a style can be considered Chinese martial art without the other building block as long as it has striking is considered Chinese martial art. And the name will end with quan, whereas a style that don't have striking, the name can't end with quan, therefore end up with other names such as shuai jiao, which is just Chinese wrestling. But some of you might think, okay, but Chinese wrestling is also part of Chinese martial art. Well, this statement is both true and false depending on the context and perspective, which is something that I'll be discussing in my next video. The goal of this video is just to clarify that it is definitely incorrect to think that Chinese martial art originated with grappling. In fact, even if we take a Chinese martial art traditional style that has a good portion of shuaifa or throwing method or diefa, tripping method, they're still not exactly the same as grappling in the modern context, right? In modern days, due to MMA, if we talk about grappling, we're basically referring to Roman Greco wrestling, freestyle wrestling, jiu-jitsu, judo, and Chinese wrestling, that kind of approach. Those we consider as grappling styles of martial arts. But if you look at the majority of the Chinese traditional martial arts, when they're talking about shuaifa, right, note that shuaifa and shuaijiao is different. So the point of this video is to show you that it's definitely incorrect to say that Chinese traditional martial arts originated from predominantly grappling. That is definitely wrong. Any style that we find today can trace its origin back to the early Qing or the late Ming dynasty, definitely were invented with the main focus on fist striking, not on grappling. I also hope that at least some of you has learned a bit of history about Chinese martial art through this video, and you also now knows the naming system that the Chinese people used to describe their martial art from the late Ming to Qing to Republic era to this modern day. And this can also then let you realize that is why some of our more authentic traditional martial art practitioners in China, we prefer to call it 传统拳 rather than any of the other names that people use to describe Chinese martial art to this day. Well, so I hope that you guys have enjoyed this video and find this content informative. Got any constructive comment or suggestion for future content, please leave them in the comment below, and I'll definitely get back to you as soon as possible. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe on YouTube channel. Make sure you click on the bell icon so that you get updated as soon as I upload any new content. And if you can support me on Patreon, that would be greatly appreciated. As always, I'll give a shout out to all my Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much for supporting me over this pandemic. It has helped me tremendously. Also let me know that there are people out there that appreciate my effort on spreading genuine knowledge and information about traditional Chinese martial art, which is a field that is very confusing and convoluted in general public, especially in this modern society. Lastly, I'd like to wish everybody to stay healthy and safe, get your vaccination if you can, and even then still try to avoid social contact if possible. And let's hope that whole pandemic nightmare will eventually be behind us once everyone reaches 95% of herd immunity and our life can go back to normal. Thanks for watching TriEssence Martial Art channel, and I'll see you next time. Keep well.